So now let's continue with another really important aspect of our discussion today. This time we're exploring community-based solutions to online hate. And chairing this session is Dr. Wesley Chrichlow, who's a visiting scholar at YWCA Canada. This is the nation's leading organization for 2S LGBTQI people and issues. So Wesley, I invite you to turn on your camera and microphone to start off the last panel of the day. So Wesley, please.
Thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Wesley Chrichlow, Professor of Criminology, Critical Race Theory, Anti-Black Racism at Ontario Tech. I would move straight into the panelists and introduce them all. Before I introduce, I just want to be sure they are all here. Bernie, are you here? No, Bernie's not. Michelle, are you here?
Yes, sir.
I just want to be sure before I introduce everyone. Amanda, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Excellent. Okay, so I would start with Michelle, Dr. Michelle Ferrier. Executive Director of Media Innovation Collaboratory and incubator for media and technology communication solutions. She's the founder of TrollBusters, an educational service for journalists experiencing digital harms, and author of Harassment, the impact on female journalists and their reporting published in 2018. Dr. Ferrier is an internationally recognized award-winning technologist, journalist, scholar, researcher, author, and speaker around technology and digital online spaces. The pioneering research mapping media deserts and monitoring and modeling digital harms has won her grant support from organizations like the Knight Foundation, Democracy Fund, and others. Dr. Ferrier has also won international and national and professional recognition, including 6 Anthem Awards for social impact work, the AEJMC Professional Freedom and Responsibility Award for Press Freedom Work, and the Dewey Community Service Award for SXSW. Welcome, Dr. Ferrier.
Thank you.
Amanda Arella, the Director of Public Policy Advocacy and Strategic Communications at YWCA Canada. Amanda is a lawyer, strategic thinker, and passionate advocate for gender equity. Amanda brings research, policy, communications experience to her role gained from working in community organizations, international NGOs, and government. Prior to joining the YWCA in Canada, Amanda had spent 2 years honing her advocacy skills as a litigator at a national law firm with a focus on administrative, privacy, and health law. Amanda has also served as Director of Communications on the Legal Information Clinic at McGill, where she developed and launched a court accompaniment program aimed at increasing access to justice for members in the Montreal community who face barriers navigating the legal system. I hope Bernie can join us. Mr. Bernie Farber is the chair of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, acknowledged as one of Canada's most accomplished NGOs and CEOs. His career spans more than 30 years focused on human rights, diversity, anti-racism, and extremism. His efforts have been documented in numerous Canadian human rights publications, books, newspapers, magazines. His work has also been cited for its expertise in a number of academic publications. Mr. Farber has successfully run large NGOs and foundations such as the Canadian Jewish Congress, the Palmoma Foundation, and retired as the Executive Director of the Mosaic Institute. Welcome, everyone. I guess we can start with Michelle, who's first on my screen. And Michelle, it's nice to meet you, finally.
Great to meet you as well. Good to see you and good to be here today. Thank you. Great. I want to just provide a brief introduction. So if I may, I'm going to share my screen and share a little bit of the work that we've been doing at the Media Innovation Collaboratory over the past 7+ years now. We are here today to really discuss the ideas and work that we've been doing around community-based solutions to hate. And the work that we do really comes with a holistic lens from the work that we've done in monitoring the online hate directed at journalists, to looking at and building curriculum for our journalism educators and students of media to be able to stay safe and be safe online while doing their work. We're here today because of some of what we've seen online, a very fervent and targeted approach to addressing narratives, our cultural narratives, and particularly some of the tools and platforms that we use in our professional work have been weaponized against us and our ability to be able to share and promote good, valid news and information to our communities. The work that we've done at the Media Innovation Collaboratory is grounded in some of the work that Wesley mentioned as well, including some of the relationships that I have with the Journal of Online Trust and Safety, where I am an editorial board member, the Journalism Safety Research Network. I am a co-lead of the North America and Western Europe regions, alongside of my colleagues in the Journalism Safety Network at University of Sheffield. And I'm also the president of the International Association of Women in Radio and Television, which is a professional organization that represents over 500 women journalists and broadcasters around the globe, working in geographies such as Afghanistan, Moldova, the Philippines, the African continent, in Nigeria, Ethiopia, Cameroon, and elsewhere. Our work over the past several years has been centered around being a thought leader and helping to look at what has been happening in digital harms and how to mitigate those as a journalist working professionally in digital spaces, as well as help our students and other communicators, as well as young people, understand how the system works and to be able to come to our digital spaces with a discerning mind. Truck Defender Magazine is one of the products and services that we offer through the Media Innovation Collaboratory. And it's a monthly magazine that's a deep dive into digital spaces, looking at digital harms against journalists and others across the globe in our regional reports, examining case studies of particular cases of women journalists and others who've been under attack, and looking at strategies for how to mitigate for those harms and come back and bounce back stronger. That work has taken us into helping develop curriculum, as I said, for J school educators as well as others, to help young people understand how to navigate the digital culture and environment and equip them with the skills not only to be users, but to be creators and leaders in digital spaces. Some of the work that we've done has won Anthem Awards. These are social impact awards for responsible technology that have been built with a holistic view in mind. For example, our Generation Zeitgeist curriculum is one that looks at the internet from its infrastructure all the way through algorithms, identity formation, community development, and others, and helps young people look at and examine their role and ways of being in digital spaces. So I'm going to run through a few of the pieces of this curriculum that were designed for teachable moments. This is a large wall scale poster that can be printed out at about a 4-foot by 6-foot size for classroom use, for library use, putting it on the walls in spaces where young people are engaging in those digital tools. We help them look at their digital footprint and understanding how and what they put on the web and how it's used by companies as fodder for money and attention. We help them understand how that identity is shaped and then marked by the data that they're putting out, how they're influenced and seen, and that data is utilized in these spaces, how to connect with others on the web and how to identify them as real or inauthentic bots and other ways. Help them look at and understand the situations online and look at grooming behaviors that happen on the web. Help them understand how to de-anonymize those bad actors and find out who's actually targeting them. How to assess and determine sources online and to determine for themselves media literacy and digital literacy online, understanding how to build and develop a culture of safety with allies and others. And our materials, like the Generation Zeitgeist curriculum, like our escape room competition and our Level Up games are all designed to be targeted to young people and early career professionals to help develop their skills in understanding how to navigate digital spaces with ease and grace. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Ferris. So I guess we'd move next to Amanda. I think Bernie has joined us on the phone, so I will move to Bernie after you, Amanda. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm very excited to be here today on behalf of YWCA Canada. And I'd like to sort of start by setting the scene as to why YWCA is participating in this conference. And so, as you may know, our organization has been working to advance gender equity in Canada and improve the lives of women, girls, and gender diverse people for over 150 years. But typically, people are more familiar with us as a frontline service organization. So our local YWCAs are working in 300 communities across the country in 9 provinces and 2 territories. And in that work, we run the largest network of shelters and affordable housing for women, gender diverse people and their families, are the 2nd largest provider of childcare and the largest provider of employment services in counseling to women. But we also do a lot of work nationally to build young leaders. So we train youth on how to be leaders in their communities through our leadership conferences, our girl centers, our summer camps, and leadership programming in schools. And that's really how we got involved in work on online hate, because we saw the unfortunate reality that as the young people we were working with engaged in online spaces, particularly when they were advocating about issues they were passionate about, they were exposed to very high amounts of shocking and often violent hate speech. Of course, we've responded and adapted our leadership programming to prepare participants and the trusted adults in their life about how to engage safely in digital spaces, how to process and report online hate, and how to support one another in these experiences. But we also know that digital safety training is really only one side of the equation. And if we want to truly create online spaces that are safe for girls, young women, and gender diverse folks, where they can fully and freely express their views, we also really had to engage with the digital spaces themselves. And that was the inception and the thinking behind our project Block Hate, Building Resilience Against Online Hate Speech. This is a 4-year research and knowledge mobilization project funded by Public Safety Canada's Community Resilience Fund. We're currently in the 3rd of our 4th year. And the project works with a variety of stakeholders to co-create concrete solutions to online hate speech and technology-facilitated violence in communities across Canada. I imagine that over the course of this panel, we'll get into some of the recommendations that we're seeing coming out of that research, but I'll talk a little bit about some of the initial pieces of engagement that we are doing with youth. And so one of the key pieces of research work that we've done was create youth-led focus groups to talk to young folks about their experience on online hate. And we did this through creating a year-long leadership fellowship model for young staff in the YWCA movement across the country. And so we worked with 8 young QT BIPOC leaders in our movement to give them training, give them resources and skills building over a year-long fellowship program, a paid program. As part of that, we trained them in participatory action research so that they could then go into communities and convene focus groups. And so I'll maybe pause there for now, but very excited to highlight some of the key learnings from those focus groups as well.
Looking forward. Thank you so much, Amanda. Bernie, can you hear me?
I can. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can. So, welcome, Bernie. Nice to have you. The floor is yours for a couple of introductory remarks.
Thank you very much. People used to believe that unlimited free speech was good for society because they believed that the best argument would always win in the marketplace of ideas. We now know that arguments made by people with money, power, or an army of abusive followers take up more space than their arguments actually might deserve, and marginalized people get silenced, threatened, and edged out of the discourse. Online hate attacks free expression. Absolute free speech undermines free expression. It's kind of paradoxical if you think about it, but sadly it's a fact. Online hate silences women, people of color, LGBTQ plus persons, and other equity-seeking groups. We need to do something about that. Their free speech is more important, as far as I'm concerned, than the hate speech, harassment, and threats that come from racists, bigots, homophobes, trolls, and white supremacists. Our current system, where we allow social media companies to self-police, demonstrably benefits racists and harassers and trolls, and allows them to silence or harm women and people of color, LGBTQ+, and persons of many other persuasions. And that, by the way, is just online. That hate, that harassment, and those threats, which I already heard being discussed, also play out offline. Far-right movements in Canada have grown exponentially, just as online hate has gotten out of control. Canada's populist far-right movement has gotten large enough, with enough of their supporters throwing their personal money into their activism, that they could occupy Ottawa, as you will recall, for weeks. The populist far-right movement wants to take power, democratically or not, and use that power against their real anti-perceived enemies. They talk about putting health officials, politicians, and just their critics on trial for treason and hanging them. And if you're looking at a Canadian account spreading hate online, you're probably looking at an account run by a person who supports Canada's far-right movement. We believe that to truly defeat the far right, that we need to address the inequalities and the bleak outlook for the future that make its conspiracy theories, scapegoating, and easy answers to complex problems appealing to a growing segment of our society. That will probably also have the effect of making the internet a safer and kinder place. And in the meantime, we believe in using every ethical and reasonable tool at our disposal to slow down the growth of the far-right movement, to prevent it from chipping away at community safety and a sense of belonging and human rights. We don't know whether this government has the expertise to put together legislation against online hate, or whether they'll get there before the next government. Doesn't look that way to me, sadly, and things don't look promising. But there's plenty we can do in the meantime to create a fence of protection around marginalized groups. So as I close this first part, we have to understand that we believe in building an anti-hate and pro-democracy movement that can counter far-right events and demonstrations and disrupt their messaging. We've seen time and time again that when they are outnumbered and reminded that their views are still unpopular with a majority of people, that it demoralizes them and sets them back. We don't have the answers to online hate, but we know that the answers will involve creating serious penalties and consequences for the willfully irresponsible operators of social media platforms. And we also know that communities have the power to protect, console, and uplift each other when people who are experiencing online hate need our assistance. We have the power to be more resilient, even if we can't force social media companies to listen to their better angels. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing what my fellow panelists have to say.
Thank you so much, Bernie, and all panelists. I would like to pose a question to the three of you before we open it up to the floor, a couple of questions, and then time permitting, open up to the floor. If we think of hate crime laws as a way intended to convey to victims and their families that they are valued, they're human, they're respected, etc., against and protected in particular from acts of prejudice and discrimination. But then the conundrum or the challenge, of course, with some communities is their relationship with law enforcement. So, and that the lack of trust in law enforcement, or the lack of trust in the state, or in certain forms of surveillance. This is a forum on community responses to hate online. What solutions do you propose as ways forward, as an integrative approach to address these issues, given the analysis from the three of you? Okay, thank you. Given that, sorry, a message came in from me, I wanted to read it. Given that, Amanda, Michelle, your focus was on gender, and Bernie's is speaking strictly about a much larger and inclusive picture there around his work he has done in the Jewish community. What do you propose as an integrative social justice approach for addressing these issues from a community-based perspective? I'll start with you, Bernie.
Well, a report from the BC Human Rights Commissioner, Wesley, suggests that people who go to the police to report a hate incident are disappointed in the process. That police might investigate when they themselves think it's a serious crime, like an assault, if there's plenty of evidence, but they're really unlikely to take action on, say, an online threat, unless it uses crystal clear language and unless they think that the threat is actually likely to happen. And this has all been documented recently from the BC Human Rights Commissioner, which shows that people who have faced hatred have better outcomes when they have community supports. And the report, by the way, is called From Hate to Hope, and it's an inquiry into hate in the COVID-19 pandemic. It is really worth a read. So giving resources to community programming is one way to help people targeted by online hate. The fact of the matter is that police are simply not trained to participate and to understand hate crime. There used to be a time when there were actually anti-hate units connected to most urban police services. That's gone the way of the dinosaur. Sadly, what we have seen, and I don't say this with any pleasure at all, is that when there are demonstrations of any kind, as we have seen, by the way, in Ottawa and British Columbia, in Toronto and elsewhere, it has to do, for example, with trans kids and the extreme Christian right banding together and even trying to block school entrances. When the police show up, they're more often than not likely to take the side of the anti-trans demonstrators than they are to take the side of the community. So what does this all tell us? We have a lot of work to do. Some have suggested the creation of safe zones around schools. Well, that would be terrific if the police were there to actually uphold the legislation around the safe zones. I just don't trust that happening. And I don't trust that the police are yet fully involved and fully integrated into understanding what hate crime is. So we have a long way to go from training police officers, from getting them to understand what the issues are, but more importantly, from my perspective, is to work with community, giving various communities, the trans community, LGBTQ plus community, the Jewish community, the people of color communities, BIPOC community, let's find ways to bring them together to stand in unison. There are safety in numbers, I do believe.
Thank you, Bernie. Michelle?
Sure, thank you so much. Part of the work that I do is sitting on a working group here in the United States that's looking at this very issue of misinformation and disinformation and how we might be able to solve for that. Part of our work is looking directly at the platforms themselves and what kinds of regulations we might be able to put in place, revisiting Section 230 and the immunity against the platforms for the kinds of harms that their users are putting on the platform, as well as the ways in which their algorithms and the biases of those algorithms may also be fomenting harm online. I'm not as hopeful that we will be able to put in place legislation that will actually remove the impunity that people are currently able to operate with. As we've just heard, when people do go to the police or other authorities, with their attention is not paid to their case. What we hear and what has been reported over and over is that the online harms are not seen as real or actionable until something actually happens in physical space. Now, as a journalist receiving death threats, it's not a comfort to know that the police aren't going to come until something actually physically happens to you. And so the solutions really have come from the individual, as well as Bernie has said, from communities banding together to create norms on the platforms that they're working in and to be allies to people when they're experiencing this kind of harm. As Bernie said, that is one of the ways and one of the best ways is to shore up these community spaces by collectively working to help elevate everybody's ability to discern good content from bad content and be able to critically assess what they're reading online. I'm concerned that, unfortunately, where I see the legislation not only here in the United States against those operators that are operating out of the US context, is that there is very little collaboration between the platforms themselves on how they solve for online hate. And it makes it very challenging, in particular in the cases of women journalists who I represent, because the hate typically comes across platform. And it's in a much more complex form where they may be getting DMs from Twitter, emails from other sources, TikTok videos behind the scenes, and other things coming from a variety of different vectors of attack, and leaving them unable to go to the police or even to their own employers if they're employed by someone in order to be able to get redress for these harms. And so one of the things that we have really focused on over the past few years is not only digital security, helping people understand personally what they can do to set boundaries and protect themselves, their devices, their homes, and their families, but also to help them look at ways in which they can build and operate securely moving forward so that they can understand and minimize the types of risks that would come to them. I would love to see some legislation that actually does target the individuals, users. And I think that's tied to the larger conversation that we're having right now about digital identity, and how our digital identity is very much tied to our physical identity, whether it is our financial data, our location data, our voting data, our residential data. All of that data is accessible and unfortunately is being weaponized and moving the online harms into physical space. And so I would love to work across borders, especially given the concerns that I have when some of the harms are coming from state actors and government officials themselves who are trying to suppress bad press coming from journalists about them. We can't go to the police because the police are going to come get us. So we have some challenges in terms of who we might be able to report to get the kind of safety we need when the government itself is the target that is attacking us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Amanda?
Yeah, I echo everything that has been expressed so far. I think that the youth that we work with and who we consulted for our own research highlighted their deep sense of mistrust and long mistrust with law enforcement in many of the communities that they're part of. And so looking to other solutions on how safety can happen online, and as you know, we know the offline world that has all too real consequences from online hate. And interestingly, one of the things that came up was, although criminal law was not identified as a viable option or path forward, there was a sense from the youth that we worked with that other legal avenues and channels could hold potential. And so thinking through Canada's forthcoming online safety legislation, one of the things that we recommended based on sort of the articulations from the youth that we worked with was the idea of some sort of independent monitoring and sort of mediation body, which we've pitched sort of as a digital safety officer who can really be that quasi-governmental, independent source that can help hold government to account, but can also hold social media platforms and other tech companies to account, particularly around the transparency of their processes. Because one of the things that we also know happens is someone will flag a hateful comment, will flag a threat, and then it sort of goes into the ether. We don't know what happens with that particular user, although it's all too likely that they will continue spouting off hateful speech across platforms. And then often it is the person who flagged that hateful content that gets surveilled. And so thinking of a solution that can be an impartial party who can really provide clarity around how threats to online threats and offline threats are assessed and acted on, I think is a really essential piece of the solution.
Thank you so much, the three of you. But
Wesley,
go ahead, Lenny. Yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, because what Amanda said is great, and it's absolutely correct. But having been appointed to and having sat on the Online Safety Commission to give the government some ideas and concepts for a bill that would address online safety and online harms, I have to tell you all that I'm not particularly overwhelmed with how that ended. It ended with a promise that there would be movement towards this bill. We started working on this and completed it at the end of June of last year. And I really haven't heard a damn thing since then. And my fear is that nothing is going to happen, that this was really just sort of another trip down memory lane in order to keep people like ourselves, a little bit more quiet when it comes to these issues. And what is going to happen, and it will, I'm terribly sad to say this, and I hate to predict this kind of stuff, but there will be another incident, whether it's an incident like we saw, the tragic incident in London, Ontario, with the murder of an entire Muslim family, whether somebody walks into a church or a synagogue or a mosque and starts shooting. We will see another incident that will have been motivated by online hate, and people are going to go nuts. And they're going to ask, why haven't we done something? So this is a huge and significant problem. And until we can really push government, and I mean like really push them into taking a stand, and not worry about what's going to happen in the next election, but worry more about what's going to happen to their fellow citizens, I'm not terribly sanguine about the future.
Thank you, Bernie. Permit me a privilege by trying to pull together what I'm hearing here, and you can correct me, folks. I'm hearing there's some form of inherent limitations with the current system of trying to prosecute, be it online or offline hate in general. We're hearing that there's a general consensus also too around racialized, gendered populations, populations that have historically been marginalized by the state or society, a general mistrust about what it means to bring forth complaints and for them to be taken seriously, be it online or offline. So, and Amanda, I like what you started to introduce here, where you said that the young folks you spoke with are proposing very much in a loose framework, what does it mean to think about this outside of the context of criminal justice and not just only within the confines of the criminal justice system? So it's sort of a combination of a community sort of justice, restorative justice approach to addressing the issues. If that's the case, and if we understand that that hate crime laws are limited by the very nature, how can we obscure the more pervasive forms of hate and racial bias? And I want to be clear about anti-Black racism. I want to be clear about anti-Indigenous racism. I want to be clear about, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism. Because if we mix them all together, we miss the specificity of anyone's group, and therefore the definitions become flaccid rather than specific. So how can we work towards something that is coherent, integrative, and community approach that complements each other so we can turn to communities for that support outside of the criminal justice system? I leave it open to anyone to start.
So let me try and address that one, because I think I have a perspective of some other cultures, particularly right now we're looking at our Afghanistan chapter of the International Association of Radio and Women in Television. And what we're finding is that they are very much targeted online, pursued across borders even after they've left the country, and pursued online and offline in their countries of limbo at the current time. So when we're talking about online hate, I think we need to understand that these are targeted attacks designed to get at least women journalists in particular offline, stop speaking, and to reduce their control and power. We have not seen our legislation here in the United States, at least, move towards the kind of privacy that we see in GDPR, or some of the issues that we've seen addressed through some of the recent Australian legislation. We have issues and problems with identifying the bad actors first and foremost. And so when you ask about how do we solve for and punish the people who are doing this behavior, you have to look at the environment itself and recognize that much of that behavior is anonymous behavior or happening by people that are behind sock puppets of some sort, where the first step has to be in identifying those people. We've gone through that process in working with law enforcement, working with the laws here in the United States to understand the challenges to mounting a case as an individual and getting law enforcement to take the case seriously. Once they do, having to issue subpoenas to the platforms in order to be able to get user data so that you can identify who you're suing. And then the cost to be able to mount such a cause is prohibitive for anyone except for our highest paid broadcasters and others. In the United States, to mount a defamation case for any kind of harms, defamation, libel, otherwise, online hate, etc., is upwards of about $50,000 US plus to be able to get representation. People don't take these cases pro bono. So unfortunately, even being able to seek redress through the courts requires a bankroll that many people are unable to afford.
If I can take off from there, and I think that we have to make really clear the difference between Canada, the United States, and European nations. The United States is kind of a bit of a lone actor. Here in Canada, for example, we do have some laws that make it a criminally indictable offense. Criminally indictable offense, that means the state takes over the case to knowingly and willfully promote hatred against an identifiable group, identified by race, creed, color, nationality, or sexual orientation. So we have laws like that because we don't have an amendment to our Constitution that guarantees unfettered freedom of speech. We have tried to figure out this way to balance free speech against the evils of hate speech. But I think, if you don't mind, we really do have to take a look at what has changed. How has online hate changed? And why should we see it as urgent? Now, a few people have already noted how hate online is being used to threaten female journalists, to threaten activists. It's happening all the time. Expressing hatred and intolerant views has kind of become normalized both by internet subcultures and by mainstream figures, including, by the way, a former president of the United States. At the same time, people who share those hateful views have learned that there are no consequences to being racist or harassing, or even to make threats against people's lives online. 10 years ago, people were mostly on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. And if the platforms had acted in a concerted way back then, we might have had a less dangerous social media ecosystem today. But today, there's so many niche platforms that will never really cooperate with any regulation. So the issue has gotten in an order of magnitude that's even more difficult to address by governments. And it's urgent because the internet is used for stochastic terrorism. And basically, if you convince enough people that there is an existential threat, if you create an environment where violence is tolerated or celebrated to solve that threat, and if you give them a target, eventually somebody in the audience will act out the desire of the entire group to carry out serious violence. In the past, when these people wanted to do this kind of crap, they would stand on street corners and hand out leaflets. And if 10 people picked up a leaflet and one person found it interesting, that was considered a good day. Today, you just open up your laptop and you could reach hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions. And of those, you just need one person. And that's why, for example, lie that all transgender persons and people who perform drag are pedophiles is such a dangerous statement. The people who spread that lie have already identified school boards, and all ages drag shows at libraries are targets. And their audiences are already justifying violence towards the so-called pedophiles who aren't actually pedophiles at all. So our society has become a danger field. Before, the danger was not all that much in your face. Today, it's not only in your face, but it's directly impacting on some of our lives. I don't think a week goes by that I haven't received a death threat to either me or a member of my family. And when we were able actually to track down one of these death threats, and finally a police service acted, of course, the person left the jurisdiction. 2 years later, when we found him, the police service, another police service where he was found, basically said, oh, we don't have time to go out and do this type of thing. So, again, it comes back to having the will to do it. And if they don't have the will to do it, I think communities are going to have to find ways to band together and to really protect themselves, to create their own fences of protection.
Thank you, Bernie.
I think when Bernie talks about what's changing with online hate and the order of magnitude, I think the intensity of online hate that we're seeing, it's something very well known within YWCA Canada that we talk about, prepare anyone that we're putting on our platform, that it is not an if you will receive online hate. It is a question of when and to what extent and to what intensity. And something one of our focus group participants really clearly articulated that has sat with us as an organization is this idea that simply existing online as a woman, a trans person, or a gender diverse person is seen as an invitation to hate. And so while that is just an incredibly overwhelming scope of the issue, I also agree that the solution is really centering the communities who are experiencing this impact and trusting them as the experts in their own experience, that they know what they need, they know how they can take care of themselves and protect themselves, and how they can work with other communities, because it's a common issue that we're seeing sort of across the board, but that will take significant resources. And putting those resources in the hands of the people that are most affected by the issue.
Yeah, Amanda, your point is well taken in terms of trust in the communities, because I think it's an incredible piece of the work we are doing in terms of being able to trust and resource and resource and trust. Yeah, so that's an important point. I would like to open the floor to the three of you to ask each other questions if you have any questions for each other. So you have been hearing from each other, and before, as you ask those questions, I would also like you to think about what promising interventions can we think about as we move forward for online hate, but in particular, do you have questions for each other first?
If I can, I'd like to put a general question out there, because I really think our future is in our youth, I think it's hugely important that when we deal with online hate, we have to understand that it leads to real world activism and, sadly, real world violence. And at the far right, which drives all of this, has really some effective propagandists and content creators, and some of them are young people. We have to find out how to engage our young people who are maybe a bit more progressive, maybe understand the fears and troubles here. But I say it right out, I'm a baby boomer. I'm of a past generation. I couldn't even figure out how to get onto this Zoom thing, for goodness sake. And I thought I'd do that inside out and backwards. So I challenge my colleagues here. How is it that we bring youth on board to help us fight this fight? It's an important fight.
If I can, Wesley.
Yes.
I would love to work with the YWCA as well, but one of the things that we have done is co-create our materials with young people, with young professionals and students and others, really because their experience has been so unique, especially during the past 2 years of COVID and the pandemic. Young people have had the most experience, I think, probably being online and in courses, etc., and have seen harms come from a variety of different spaces. One of the things that we're doing with the curriculum that we had built with young people is expanding that to have young people developed as peer educators to train each other on digital forensic skills. And so we're running what's called the Great Escape Competition. It's a project where they're taking the basics of the curriculum, understanding how digital forensics, mapping skills, geolocation, helping them understand how the internet works from the posters that you saw earlier, and actually helping them to develop the teaching and game modules that they will be deploying with their peers to compete against one another. And so we've created a prototype and a competition that we're going to be running starting in the fall, using a variety of young teams from across the world to help develop materials that they can help teach each other about how to be good citizens online. Thank you.
Excellent. Amanda?
Yeah, so that idea of working with youth in a co-creation way is something very central to our work at YWCA as well. And specifically, and yes, we'd love to collaborate, certainly. And specifically for our block hate research, one of the things that we found was so successful was having youth in rooms with each other by themselves without like older adults around, and creating spaces of trust and safety that allowed young people to articulate their thoughts and feelings in a way that perhaps they wouldn't have shared with people that they saw as authority figures. And that gave us such a rich amount of insight into how they're experiencing online hate, but also what solutions they think are viable. And so I think really honoring the wisdom of young people and giving them the room and space, and again, the resource support to be able to craft their own solutions. But also, I think one of the things we're thinking through now and sort of grappling with is how we can create a cross-generational learning framework as well, not only for young folks to learn from older people, but also as young people are, really the experts in the digital age and are adapting to all this new technology, how they can share with older adults some of the learnings that they have experienced. And so we see especially misinformation and disinformation being one where young people perhaps are a bit more able to navigate and identify potential misinformation, and how we can leverage their knowledge and expertise to work with the adults in their lives.
Great.
Great, thank you so much. So I come back to my original point. Do you have any comments or questions for each other before?
No, I am coming from a different context. Obviously, I'm not inside of Canada. And as I'm working inside these working groups, I'm always telling them that we must step outside of our US context and look at how these policies as well as recommendations play in other countries. One of the things that we're looking at here as policy recommendation is registering journalists as qualified journalists in order to weed out those that are pink slime, fake news, etc. But registering journalists might get you in trouble in the Philippines or in Afghanistan, where you're going to be identified and then put under surveillance. So we've got to be able to balance the professional roles and needs that we have as professionals in that space against the personal privacy issues, and then the disclosures that we're doing as journalists in our work, and really try and balance our policies to make sure that we can continue to be journalists and do our work around the globe.
I think sorry, Wesley, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Benny.
No, I was only going to say that I think it's incumbent upon us really to maybe perhaps identify some of the things that have worked, but also let's look at the things that have not worked till now. So for example, people talk about the issue of counter speech and, the marketplace of ideas, whether that's, engaging people who are involved in hate speech and talking to them and even making fun of them, or genuinely engaging with them to try and find any common ground to correct their errors. We've heard that that's something that might work. It actually doesn't. We haven't seen any of that really working. Yeah, there are a few examples of people, who watching the right YouTube videos and maybe changing their minds about white nationalism, but these are outlier stories. It doesn't happen often. We don't see the targets of hate or their allies engaging with people doing hate online. But as to what does work, platforms actually do a pretty good job of identifying and removing the hard T terrorist content from their sites, as well as child sexual exploitation content. We know that they do that. And they could take a similar stance against hateful content, but they themselves choose not to. We haven't seen cooperation with platforms or appealing to their better angels, as I said earlier. if they have any. We don't see that working. And the user experience continues to get worse in terms of how much hate we're seeing, not better. So in my view, any successful plan that we can put forward, we believe, would require making the major platforms significantly, financially, and even legally and criminally liable, so that they have a capitalist and personal impetus to take some serious action. And if platforms won't play ball, like Twitter under Elon Musk, we have to be ready to impose those sanctions, right up to pulling the plug on their businesses in Canada. If somebody was selling tainted food here, or cars were exploding, we wouldn't let them continue to do that. Well, I think it's the same for their websites.
Absolutely.
Bernie, always a pleasure to listen to you. I wish I can be seeing your face speak.
I wish I could see you guys too.
So a question that came in, I would like to pose to the three of you. Any of you can take it. What do you think prevent different platforms with probably similar objectives? So platforms, say for example, dating platforms or any sort of platforms, from what prevents them from collaboration and cooperation and sharing of information when these issues get raised? Anyone?
I think I put a brief answer in the chat, but I can go ahead and answer that on the microphone as well. There's some real challenges to interoperability, which is part of the issue that we're dealing with here, because the companies hold their algorithms and their business processes as trade secrets, and therefore they don't share the data with other partners. So if you're a target of an attack on Twitter, Facebook, email, etc., you have to, at this point, escalate your complaint through each channel separately. When we know that there is a coordinated campaign across platforms. So the inability for us to be able to operate across platforms, be able to shut down a user that is manipulating terms of service across each of those platforms in order to be able to subvert their speech, or moving their account and going to a new platform, that we're able to kind of corral them by looking at it more holistically. The challenge, as I said, with these platforms is the trade secrets and our inability to be able to peer into their systems. And we've seen that with the whistleblowers that have come forward and told us, we know there are harms in our product and we are just unwilling to solve for them. So that does require, as Bernie has said, the community to respond in kind, whether that means removing ourselves from Twitter, as many news organizations have done over the past few months, looking for alternative places to publish. And one of the other strategies that we use with our women journalists is not only counter narratives, speaking back on the platform against the attacks and calling out the attacks and how the attacks are happening, so that you're using the attack as a tool to educate the public about what's happening around them, but also using multiple platforms and being a multi-platform operator so that your voice has the same kind of spread and reach as the collective voice of the attackers.
Mm-hmm. Amanda Arella, any takes on that?
I think that Michelle is spot on with highlighting how business interests are really inhibiting collaboration across different companies on this issue, and all the more reason to really create that kind of regulatory system where there is accountability with sanctions attached to them to ensure that platforms are collaborating with government and hopefully also with each other to come together to have kind of cross-sectoral solutions on this issue, because we know that online hate is across platforms and also operating cross-border. So not just one country's solutions cannot be the only kind of way that we're taking this approach. We have to think also internationally how we can collaborate globally on this issue.
Yes.
Thank you, Amanda.
And this is an issue, of course, that affects hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And I was kind of interested at one time with the idea of a digital safety commissioner of some form or another that would be, arm's length from government, but would be funded by government. But then as I began to think that one through, I thought to myself, well, how much staff will this person need? The number of complaints and the number of issues that even the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, and we're a small group, see online are astronomical. We don't have the kind of personnel to deal with it, not even close. So we're talking, potentially thousands, if not tens of thousands of complaints on a regular basis. It's a lot of work. And right now we see how much oomph the federal government wants to put into online safety. Barely none. And when you talk to ministers and others involved, they'll all nod their heads sagely and say, of course, we have to do this. We must do this. We have to find the funding. Never happens. I've been in this business for more than 30 years, and I can tell you, unless there's something that, excuse the suggestion, triggers a violent event, they will just go on hoping that they can continue until the next election without any major scenarios.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think if I could, I just want to put a point on this, that this is not just about the online threats, and it's about that event, but also what happens to the individual after this, and the damage to their reputation, the damage to their ability to be able to earn a living, their relationships and their families and friends are damaged as a result of this. And so the impact on the victim is significant, and we have not solved for that in our laws across the board for the kinds of harms that come to someone's reputation when they're unable to find a job because of bad information, false information that's been planted online designed to get them fired from their job. So I think we need to be really careful in making sure, as I said, our solutions are global and taking into context the communities of interest, the communities of geography, the communities of profession and discipline that are all working on this issue to try and solve it. We need to have better laws in place that help us in identifying our digital spaces as impactful on our physical lives, and help our legislators understand the deep impact of this activity on individuals. It's not just an insult. It results, especially in our young people, in self-harm and other kinds of behaviors that take them offline permanently. So
Okay.
I want to really think of those impacts as we think about solutions.
Okay, great. We are going to be wrapping up in now. So what I would like to do is ask each of you to point to or leave us with a couple, moving forward, points to think about. I'm not going to use the word solutions, but points to think about in terms of what does it mean to address online hate moving forward from an innovative way, as we depart this gay pride, as we depart this Juneteenth, as we depart this Indigenous Day on the 21st. I mean, there's so many intersections happening in this month. And as Bernie said, and all of you have indicated, these challenges are just getting to the point where it seems to be out of control. So moving forward, online hate, in a nutshell, Bernie, how do you propose we start to rethink this differently from the traditional way that has failed us?
I have a lot of faith in our youth of today, and I want to go back to our youth. It wasn't all that long ago that we saw how a group of mostly teenagers drove transphobic activist Chris Elston out of Ottawa when he came to protest and make his content, in his anti-trans content in front of schools. They were able to move him out non-violently, but with a lot of heart. I see the need to engage actively with youth in a pro-democracy, anti-hate movement to counter the far right's populist, anti-democratic movement that harbors racism and anti-Semitism and anti-2S LGBTQ+ views, and of course all the other forms of hatred. I've spoken to my own children. I've spoken to many others. My own children are in their 30s already. But one of the things that I have seen in terms of how successful the other side has been is that they've made the term anti-fascist somehow a dirty term. And it's incredulous to me. I mean, my late father, who fought for the partisans in Europe during World War II in order to free himself and others, he was an anti-fascist. My late uncle, Joe Greenblatt, who was a doctor in Ottawa, who landed on the beaches of Normandy, guess what? He was an anti-fascist. What is the opposite of being an anti-fascist? A pro-fascist? So we've allowed the extreme right to actually take over our words. We've allowed them to change their meanings. And we have to take that back. We have to take back our power, and we have to take it back with the youth, because they're the ones that are going to be leading this battle. And it is a battle as we go forward. Pro-democracy, anti-hate movements with our youth, that's what I see as the way forward.
Thank you, Bernie. Michelle?
Sure. I want to point to a recent documentary that is being screened right now that I and several other people participated in, called Raised by Wolves. It's a documentary put out by West Virginia researchers Dana Kester and her husband Joel Beeson. It is about how the internet is used and weaponized to recruit children to white supremacist movements and other different types of activities through online recruitment and other gaming tools. And I think Bernie is spot on in that the far right and others have learned how to use the distributed nature of the internet, as well as subvert the terms of service on these various platforms, to be able to organize, create a sense of belonging for young people who feel excluded in their local communities, and provided a place for them to feel welcome and in action around things that are important to them. And so as we look to creating solutions, we've got to, as Bernie has suggested, mobilize our young people, recruit them into a movement that is about sharing culture, a culture of safety and care online, and making sure that they are inculcated with the kinds of norms that we'd like to see culturally in our various communities around the globe, knowing that those norms are going to be different by culture and by geography. Thank you.
Thank you. Amanda?
Yes, I think that the ideas of support, care, and community are ones that really light the path forward on how we can meaningfully address this issue, and also to thinking through accountability, not only for the platforms that profit off of online hate and the governments that have a responsibility to their citizens to address this issue, but also to all of us as users of digital platforms. Some of the things, perhaps like as a final thought on YWCA's report, the youth that we consulted understood themselves as being central to the solution of addressing online hate. They know that they have a responsibility to engage in a good way on online platforms and to support the kind of behavior that they want to see. And so I think that understanding is one of empowerment and really empowering young people, but also all other users of online space to understand that they're part of the solution.
Thank you so much, Michelle, Amanda, Bernie. I'd like to bring this session to an end, and thank you for your exemplary presentation, empirically driven, solid work, and your activism behind the work in engaging communities. On behalf of Verizon's, on behalf of TMU, Toronto Metropolitan University and Diversity Institute, I thank you for being on this panel. And you can tell I'm still with Verizon in my head. But thank you so much. It's been an incredible pleasure moderating this session, with listening to all of you. I've learned a great deal. And I pass it over now to, I think it's Juan or Nadine to take it from here. Thank you so much, folks. Enjoy the week.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wesley. Thank you very much. And a great thank you again to all our panelists, Michelle, Amanda, and Bernie. Another great panel, really emphasizing some things that really hit very close to my heart, as in the past, a lot of work on civil society, that empowering impact of knowledge and digital literacy, particularly for strengthening youth agency. I mean, as Bernie mentioned, our futures in our youth, and that is such an important point. And really the power of civil society solidarity and coalition building in creating those safe spaces, right? And changing the discourses and changing the culture and pressuring the state and enforcing that accountability of the state's institutions, really, really key to what many of you emphasizing. And also how finding lasting and effective solutions really rests on building solutions that can amplify that power of civil society. And many of you touched on a really interesting point I found of creating these partnerships between civil society and the state. Some examples around these bridging institutions like independent quasi-state institutions and so on. But never forgetting, as many other panels pointed out as well, that this requires changes in the state, right? As discussed earlier and as reflected in that very justified mistrust of state institutions by many communities. But one message that stood out to me from the panel, just it's not in finding civil society or community-based solutions, it's not a matter of dumping the responsibility of addressing the issues on communities and individuals themselves, right? So it's a much bigger picture. So thank you very much again for all that.